Hello everyone and welcome to day number 2 of the 2025 Isle of Wight Masters, proudly presented by Coatsi Chess, the official recap. And today we have round 3. In case you haven't tuned in to the round 1 recap, this tournament is 90 minutes plus 30 seconds increment per move from move 1. And we have 2 very exciting games to show you. So going straight on to the chess, in the first game we're looking at board number 1, English International Master and Women's Grandmaster Ivanka Hauska from England takes on Bobby Cheng from Australia, the top seed in the tournament. So a very tough ask for Ivanka, and we'll see how she gets on. So Ivanka starts off with 1d4, Bobby plays knight to f6, knight to f3 from Ivanka, c5, c3, d5, bishop f4, knight c6 and e3. So you see that Ivanka is opting for a London system here. Many top players are still playing it. I remember many games in this line in the World Youth Chess Championships. Very solid choice, and we'll see how Bobby tries to play against it. So knight to h5 from Bobby, bishop to g3, knight takes, Bobby now has the bishop pair, h takes from Ivanka, and e6. So see, here we can see Bobby has the bishop pair, but Ivanka's got this open h-file, and with the bishop most likely coming to d3, there's going to be pressure. So in this line, you can see that from the black pieces, you don't want to castle kingside because you're going to be run into a big attack. So we'll see how Bobby goes for it. So Ivanka plays knight bd2, we have g6, fianchetting the dark squared bishop, bishop d3, queen to b6, and rook b1. So you can see here that with rook b1, Ivanka's saying, okay, I'm not going to castle queenside, and most likely I'm going to castle kingside, but I'm going to see what black does first. Very solid position so far from both sides. Black's ever so slightly better, but a long fight ahead. With a5 from Bobby, you can see that on the queen side here, Bobby's trying to push this pawn down to a3, almost like we saw yesterday in round number 1 with these flank pawns, trying to create weaknesses on either the king or queen side of the board, and then trying to exploit them later on. So we can see now that Ivanka plays queen to e2, we have bishop to g7, and this was a very interesting choice that Ivanka went for next. She played d takes c5, changing the structure of the game, and always when you have pawn exchanges, the position always becomes completely different. And we can now see that in this position, Bobby has the central pawns and Ivanka's taken on c5, and it's very interesting. Also another move was just castle, keeping the tension in the center, but Ivanka goes for d takes c5, which is definitely very interesting. We have queen takes c5 and e4. Ivanka's exploding in the center, and also as well, I presume her thought process was that Bobby's a grandmaster rated over 200 points above her, so a draw would be a fantastic result for her. She would gain a lot of points, and this is what I think she was going for in this game with this choice. So we've got e4, we've got castles from Bobby, and we have knight to b3 from Ivanka, hitting the queen on c5, queen b6, e takes in the center, e takes. And here, it's very interesting, Ivanka went for queen to e3, looking to get into an endgame and get this queen exchange in. I can understand her thought process here. She was, as I mentioned before, most likely going for a draw. But as you can see in the game, after the queens come off and f takes, you can really see these potential weaknesses now that Ivanka has, especially this isolated pawn here on e3. And we've got these double g pawns, and you'll see in many lines as we go through the game how black actually looks to exploit these. So instead of this, it was possible for Ivanka to go for something like castles, and the game of chess goes on. We've got this knight most likely coming into the d4 square, and it's a game of chess which goes on. But Ivanka opts for the queen exchange, and we go into an endgame after queen takes e3 and f takes e3. We then have a4 from Bobby. You see he's pushing this isolated pawn down the board, and again looking to create this weakness on the queen side. This knight then comes into the center from Ivanka. We then have a3, you can see it's coming all the way down the board. And now after b4, you can now see the control that there is on this b2 square. And while this pawn might look quite mere now, there's many potential attacks. Now this pawn's only 2 squares away from the promotion on a1. And there's many lines that the pieces can coordinate well. And then you find that this pawn actually becomes a very useful asset. So it does tie down white a lot, and especially with this rook on a8, it is going nowhere. So you can see again similar themes from round one from these top players pushing these flank pawns. So we've got b4 and we have knight takes d4 from Bobby. And here there were a lot of options for Ivanka. You know, she can take with either the e pawn, the c pawn, or the knight, all of which are good moves. I was thinking in the game that she might have gone for e takes, because now this pawn on e3 is not isolated anymore. It comes into the centre of the board. Even taken with the c pawn makes a lot of sense as well. But Ivanka opts for knight takes, and now we have a really strong knight in the centre of the board. So we have bishop to e5. Bobby's going after this weakness that we can see here, the double g pawn, and Ivanka plays king to f2 defending this. We then have rook to d8. Bishop then comes to e2, and this is a very nice positional move from Ivanka. She realises in the position that this bishop on d3 here is not too well placed. She's looking to play bishop e2, bishop f3, and put this bishop on the long diagonal. So very nice there. Also many possible moves. You know, you've got rook bc1, rook hd1, all of which are fine moves. But after bishop e2, we get rook d6 from Bobby, looking to bring this rook over to f6 potentially and try and infiltrate on this f2 square. Here we have bishop to f3. So Ivanka follows her plan. She's played bishop e2, bishop f3, putting the bishop on the long diagonal. We then have rook to f6. And here we have a slight inaccuracy. The computer doesn't like it as much. It's looking for h5 instead, trying to push this pawn on the king side of the board, because if these g-pawns fall, then you can see now Bobby's got this pawn on a3, and now this on the other side of the board we have this other pawn marching down. So you can see again Bobby's playing on both sides of the board. You know, he's almost a 2600 level GM, so he's very strong, and he's going to try and attack on both sides of the board and put a lot of pressure on Ivanka. So with king to e2 from Ivanka, we have rook to d6, and here you may have wondered, you know, can Bobby take on g3? And it's completely possible. And a sample line of how it could have gone is bishop takes d5, rook to f2, so the rook comes, infiltrates, and king to d3. But when you look at this, Bobby wouldn't have gone for this and have taken the pawn, because now when you look at the position for Ivanka, she's got a lovely bishop on d5, putting a lot of pressure onto this f7 pawn, and this knight's a monster on d4, and this king's in the centre. So even though black has the bishop pair, you can actually see now you would actually prefer, when you look at this bishop on c8 compared to this knight on d4, you'd prefer the knight. And for that reason, that's why white here is slightly better. This a2 pawn currently covered by the bishop, and with a rook of either sorts, you can see the bishop also covered pawn on g2. Coming to the f file, you can see there's going to be some pressure on f7. Therefore, for that reason, after king to e2 and rook to d6, Bobby opts to bring the rook back and defend this pawn in the centre. He doesn't want to exchange the g pawn for the d pawn, which makes a lot of sense. We then have g4 from Ivanka. She's getting out of the attack that the bishop had on the pawn. Bishop to d7, king to d2, king to g7, and g5. So you see that Ivanka's pushing this pawn further, and now she's got a grasp of the f6 and h6 squares. There's, you know, possibilities for a rook maybe to come here, and you see it really starts to restrict the king's mobility from black. So Bobby addresses this right away, and he plays f6. We have g takes f6, bishop takes, and rook to b3. A really nice move from Ivanka. Essentially, this rook here on a8 from black was the last piece which was trying to look to come into the game. But now you can see with this rook b3, this rook's tying this rook on a8 to this pawn. So Bobby has to find other ways to try and improve his position. So we have h5. You can see already now Bobby's pushing this pawn. He realised this could be a valuable asset in endgame, and we'll see in many lines how dangerous this pawn actually becomes. bishop e2 from Ivanka. You may also be wondering, this pawn on a3 now is slightly weak, so you may be wondering, well, can't Ivanka go knight c2? Well, of course you can, but a sample line after something like this would have been bishop to e6, rook takes, knight a3, if white was going to try and go for this pawn. Then another rook swings over to the a file, got knight c2 and rook takes a2. And now when you look at it, black is very slightly better because this rook, when you compare it on a2 compared to this rook on h1, is far better. And Bobby's got the bishop pair, and there's going to be pressure here on c3. And for that reason, this isn't something that Ivanka would want to go for to try and chase this pawn on a3. Therefore, after bishop to e2, we have bishop to g5, and now you can see why earlier on I was talking about on move 16 when there was this queen exchange from Ivanka, how I was thinking that maybe she would take with e-pawn because she would try and unisolate this pawn that we have on e3. Because now you can really see that black's going to try and coordinate the pieces to attack it with moves, i.e. like bishop g5, and eventually at the right time, rook e8, when it can strike. And then this pawn here on g2 is also isolated, so this is also going to try and be attacked. And then if this g2 pawn's lost, and this h pawn becomes very dangerous. So in the game from Ivanka, we have bishop to d3, and this was actually the only mistake that she made of the whole game, which shows, you know, what a strong player she is to have played so far 31 moves against almost a 2600 level GM with no mistakes. And the reason that this is a mistake is because after we have rook f6, we can see that Bobby's trying to infiltrate on this file. But slightly better from Bobby, and which was a very tricky move to find, was this move, rook to e8. The reason why this capitalizes on Ivanka's bishop d3 mistake is that essentially black's saying, okay, I will happily trade your pawn on e3 for this pawn on a3. And obviously in chess, trading a central pawn for a wing pawn is usually never a good idea because the pawn in the center of the board can control a lot more critical squares. So that's why this wouldn't be a good exchange. And a sample line of how this could go is, let's say white does take on a3, Bobby would take here, king c2, rook g3, and now you can really see how, when we spoke about earlier after this queen exchange, you can really see the weaknesses that white has in the position with this e-pawn that's now just been taken, and now g3. And you can see that once this g-pawn falls, this h-pawn of Bobby's is going to become very, very powerful. And that's why, you know, it was very interesting that Ivanka went to take with the knight. But you can also see the plus side, when you look at this knight on d4, controls a lot of critical squares. A sample line is rook a7, takes, king b3, bishop to c8, a4, rook g3, attacking the bishop, rook comes to defend, h4, and now you can see the passed pawn, and you can see why in this position, if Bobby was to find this, he did have, at this point, 19 minutes on the clock when bishop to d3 was played by Ivanka. You can now see, you know, 8-9 moves later, why this was winning, but very difficult to find with such little time. Therefore, after bishop d3, Bobby plays rook to f6. We then have rook to f1 from Ivanka, also trying to battle for the file. Rook e8, takes, bishop takes e3, king c2, king takes f6, and now we have rook to a3. And now when we look at the position, we can see that after rook c8, you can see now there's this simple threat that Bobby is looking to take this knight because it's pinned by the rook. And here was the only inaccuracy actually that Ivanka played. She played king to b3, and the computer suggests king to b2, and it's actually quite a deep point as to why this move, king b3, is an inaccuracy. And why it is, I'll show you a sample line. So after king to b3, you can see that bishop g4 was played in the game, which was a mistake by Bobby, but to capitalise on this king to b3 move, g5 should have been played. The reason is because now g5 wants to come, and Bobby wants to push these pawns down the board as quick as possible to create a pass pawn and then to get a queen. So rook to a7 would have been played, which was the best move from Jovanka, attacking this pawn on b7. And after rook to b8, this is the key point of why king to b3 is inaccuracy. After rook to a5, black has this really nice move, bishop takes d4. And the reason why this move is so strong is that black is able to remove this strong knight, which once before could come back to the king side of the board and could try and stop these pawns from marching down. And after c takes, notice this move here. This is the key move as to why king b3 is the inaccuracy. Because when the king is on b2, here, rook takes d5 would have been possible, where both these bishops are forked. But when the king's on b3 as opposed to b2, there would be this move, bishop to e6, which would pin the rook to the king, and obviously then Jovanka would lose. So from this line, just looking at the sample line of how it could have gone, h4, rook c5, rook c8, rook c5 idea is to come to rook c7, try and get to the back rank behind the pawns, come up to the 7th rank, rook c8, bishop f1, trying to stop these pawns, g4, a4, trying to push, Jovanka would try and push her own pawn on the queen side of the board, g3, king c3, takes, bishop takes a4, and after something like king d4, you can spot the winning move. There'd be a really nice move from black here, bishop to b5. You can't take because you're going to lose, but what can you do? The pawn on g2 blocks the bishop from going on this diagonal, therefore you have to take, and then this pawn will march down, and it will be a win for Bobby. Therefore, king b2, as we said, would have been slightly better because after g4, the same line, rook a7, rook a5 attacking this pawn. If the same move, bishop d4, was played, now we have this counter resource, rook to d5, and after bishop e5, rook d7, the position would be equal. So it's a very nice nuanced point as to why king b3 was an inaccuracy. But in the game, Bobby didn't capitalise on it. He played bishop to g4. We have rook to a7. Bishop comes to d2, attacking this pawn on c3. Jovanka addresses this with knight b5, rook b8, and in this position we have a draw. So a very nice game and a fantastic result from Jovanka. I could tell she was very chuffed from the live feed. You know, to draw against an opponent, a super strong grandmaster of Bobby's strength, almost 2600, like this is fantastic. So moving on to the final game of today, we have Grandmaster Thomas Spearson versus Mika Maki, an international master. So Mika starts off with pawn to d4, Thomas plays d5, Mika plays c4, and we have c6 initiating the Slav defense. We have takes, the exchange Slav variation, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3. And here Thomas plays e6, very interesting choice, but as you can now see, the bishop is blocked in behind the pawn. Playing something like knight to f6, you can then get the bishop out. Sample line would be bishop f4, bishop f5, e3, e6, bishop e2, bishop e4, castles. And as you can see, the pawn structure is very symmetrical. It's very hard to fight for a kind of advantage in this position, but it's very safe for Thomas. No risk involved whatsoever. So after e6, we have bishop to f4, queen to b6, and this here was an inaccuracy. The reason why it's an inaccuracy is because black's never threatening to take here on d4, or also to take here on b2. You see now there's two defenders in this pawn on d4, and b2 is never threatened to be taken. The reason is, let's say in the game, knight to a4 was played, an inaccuracy by Mika, but if a3 was played and we take, this is why it's an inaccuracy, and you'll see the point. After knight a4, you can see that the queen only has one square, this one on b5. White then plays this really strong move, bishop to d2, threatening to play e4 when the bishop will launch an attack on the queen. And you can see here there's no safe squares for the queen. Therefore, knight to a5 would have had to be played, and after e4, knight c5 and knight e5, you can really see the heat this queen's going to feel, and this knight you can clearly see as a target here. Therefore, instead of queen to b6, bishop to d6 would have been slightly better, just looking to trade, e3, bishop e7, just standard stuff in this line, knight f6, castles. And you can see here again, very low risk position for both sides really, and this game will probably end up in a draw. But we have queen to b6, knight to a4, queen to a5. We then have bishop to d2, attacking the queen. The queen comes back to c7, the rook comes to the c file, looking to put pressure. Now this queen's been placed on c7. Bishop to d6, you can see Thomas is lining up on this long diagonal. e3, knight f6, bishop to b5, bishop to d7, knight c5, castles, castles, and rook fc8. You can see now, this is quite an instructive point, the f rook is moved to the c file because there's never going to be really any danger here on f7 that black has to worry about. And the other rook on a8 is most likely going to be well placed here, because when white launches this kingside attack with the pawns, most likely when one lands on b5, there'll be a pawn on a6 which will take, and then this rook will open up, as we'll see in the game. So we have knight to d7. You can clearly see from this move, from the white's perspective, that Mika was most likely looking for a draw. Again, she's 2200, slightly lower rated an IM as opposed to Thomas, who's a grandmaster, and this move signifies it. Instead, something like b4 solidifies the knight on c5, and white's doing quite well with this strong knight in the centre. But instead we have knight takes d7, knight takes d7, bishop to d3, knight comes back to f6, b4. Can now see that this kingside attack is looking to come, just as we said previously. a6 meets this, because we want to meet b5 to take. a4, queen to b6, b5, and just as we said, why it was an instructive point where the f rook moved to the c file is because now after takes, knight a5, you can see now both these rooks of blacks are very well placed on the c and a files, and this knight you can see now is going to come onto this square in c5. So we have rook takes c8, rook takes c8, queen to a4, hitting this knight. So knight's got to move into the centre, knight to c4, rook to c1. You can now see there's 3 attackers and only 2 defenders. So queen to c7 is played to add an extra defender. Bishop a5, b6 stops the attack on the queen, pushes the bishop back to b4. And then we have this nice move from Thomas, knight to8, saying, okay, well, if you want to trade, we're going to trade on my own terms. I want to improve this knight from f6 to the e6 square. Maybe later it can look to come here to e4, f5, and it puts pressure here as well. So knight would be better placed on d6 as opposed to f6. So pawn to g3 is played in the game. Bishop to d6, just as we said, we'd have this move here. The knight comes. So in the game we had g3. You can clearly see here that it's looking like it's going to just fade into a draw. After queen to b7, you can see now the queen is looking to get out of the pin of the knight, and now the knight has the potential to move. Bishop takes, knight takes. After knight t5, everyone thought that the game was going to end in a draw, especially after this next move that Thomas played, knight takes e5. Just looks like everything's going just to a smooth draw. Rook takes, all the pieces come off the board, queen takes, d takes, and knight c4. And this position here, this was the key point of the whole game. You can clearly see this is an example of good knight versus bad bishop. You can see here the pawns are equal, but there's pressure here on this e4 pawn. Obviously a move like f4 would blunder this pawn here, so white has to find a way to defend it. And I think in this game, Mika was feeling the pressure here, and she obviously realised this would be a good knight versus bad bishop. And if you leave this knight on the board, even though this position is objectively drawn, black can play on, especially as the time is going down. The knight's far better in these situations than the bishop. And here, surprisingly, Mika played the blunder, bishop takes c4. And simply now, after d takes, you can clearly see that black has this passed c pawn, and the pawn is far too strong to be stopped, far too strong. Instead, something like queen to c2 should have been played. You can see now we cannot take the pawn on e5 because the queen would fall. And after something like g6, a sample line, e4, now this pawn's attacking the centre, we can play queen to c5, attacking this pawn here on b5, e takes, e6, a very nice move, because after takes, the bishop can sacrifice itself on g6, and after h takes and queen takes, black will not be able to escape the checks, and this can be a draw for black. So it was very interesting that Mika went for this. You know, the game was very nicely played by both of them, positional, very solid, no risk, and you know, it was bizarre really why the knight was taken on c4. However, d takes, queen a6, and obviously black has to show that he can win this position. But for a grandmaster of Thomas's level, this is a walk in the park. So let's see how he does it. You can now see that Mika's obviously looking to exchange the queens. A horrible blunder would be to take on a6, because now b takes, and now Mika's winning. The pawn's only 2 squares away, and we're 3 squares away as black. Therefore, after queen to a6, queen d8 is played, simply protecting this pawn on b6, controlling the d-file, and looking to help support this c-pawn. So after e4 comes, said it's a blunder by the computer, but the game was already lost for white. And let's see fantastic technique of how Mika wins. Oh, sorry, Thomas wins. So first h6 is played, nice and safe. There are many moves in this position to win, but first, there's no rush. In chess, when you have a winning position, there is no need to rush. And here we see Grandmaster endgame technique showing that. Prophylactic move, not looking for any back ranks. You know, the king's now got this loft on h7. Queen to a3, trying to stop this pawn from advancing, but we have this really nice move, queen to d2, and you can clearly see here all 3 squares up until promotion are covered, and there's simply nothing that can be done. With a few moves more in the game, queen to d6, obviously we don't want to take, because then again white would win. So we have c3, and in this position here you can see that Thomas won, Mika resigned, and yeah, it was a very interesting game, you know, going very smoothly, looking like it was going for a draw, and then out of nowhere we just had this position where it was good knight versus bad bishop, and Mika obviously panicked a little bit, took this off the board thinking that she could hold the position, but unfortunately wasn't able to. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. This has been the official day 2 of the 2025 Isle of Wight Masters, proudly presented by Coatsi Chess. We saw a brilliant game from Ivan Carrasco. Should be very proud of that game, holding the top seed in the tournament, Bobby Cheng from Australia, to a draw. And then we had this very interesting game, really instructive of flops. That's why I wanted to include it in the recap from Grandmaster Thomas against Mika. So I really hope you enjoyed this recap. Stay tuned for tomorrow because we have a double round. First round is starting at 11 o'clock and the next round is at 5. So you can watch the live commentary. It'll be Ketty and Lula doing that, and I will be bringing you the official daily recap at night time. Thank you very much for watching.